For the final part of these notes, we're going to look at the actual issue of making a price index. And this is going to be a partial lesson on making a price index. We're actually going to revisit this concept again next week when we look at inflation, because price indexes are what's used to measure inflation. So they're important to know now because they're going to help us adjust nominal GDP to real GDP, but they're also important just in and of themselves for helping us measure inflation. So the CPI, or the Consumer Price Index, we talked about this on the second day of class as one of the things we use to measure the economy. And the Consumer Price Index is actually not the one that's used to adjust real GDP, but the real GDP price deflator is so complicated that we actually don't use it as an example. It's just too complicated to actually calculate. So we're going to use the CPI as an example of how an index can be made. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics is the one that calculates the CPI, and what they do is they create a market basket that represents the purchases of a typical urban consumer in 1 year. And these three words are really important, okay? It represents the purchases of the typical urban consumer. So not everyone in the United States is reflected in this. It's a typical urban consumer, someone who lives in a metro area. What are the sorts of things they're going to buy in 1 year? So imagine a gigantic shopping cart like on the slide before, and this shopping cart includes everything like toothpaste, rent, college tuition, healthcare, car. It would include funeral expenses and oranges and apples and milk and gas and all kinds of things. So it's going to reflect more than any one person would actually buy, but it reflects the buying patterns of Americans who live in urban areas. So it's going to be a larger sum total than, for example, what any one person would buy. So each month the Bureau researches the price of each item that they've put in the basket. And if, for example, they decide that apples are something a typical urban consumer buys, well, anytime you go to the grocery store, you see there's a lot of different prices for different kinds of apples. So they pick a particular kind of apples to represent the category apple. Let's say they pick 1 pound of Honeycrisp apples, and then they pick a particular Target store, like, I don't know, the Target store in Shoreview. Okay, and they say, every time we measure apples, we're going to look at the price of Honeycrisp apples at this store. Then what they do is they add up the prices of all the goods they've put in the basket. So let's say we're going to represent apples, jeans, and coffee with Honeycrisp apples, Gap Slim bootcut jeans, and French Roast Starbucks coffee. So then they're going to weight the market basket by how much they think people buy of each good. So maybe they've determined through surveys that in a typical month, people buy 2 pounds of apples, but only 1 pair of jeans and 3 pounds of coffee. So the different items are going to be weighted in the basket based on how frequently they're purchased. So in other words, a car obviously would be a very expensive item in the market basket, but people usually only buy maybe 1 car in a year. So the car is only going to be weighted once, where milk might be weighted, 52 times to represent a gallon for each week. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics would research and find out what the price is, say January 1st, 2007, and then it would say, okay, and we've put 2 pounds of apples in the basket, so we've got $4 worth of apples and $60 worth of jeans and $27 worth of coffee. So you can see, if we scroll all the way down, that the market basket, the total cost of the market basket on January 1st, 2007 is $91. Okay, so that's the actual value of the market basket in that year. So what they would do is the next year they would go back to the same stores and they would shop for the same amounts of the same items whose prices may or may not have changed, and they would add up the total value of the market basket again. So in, say, 2008, we find that the apples got a little more expensive, the jeans got a little more expensive, and the coffee got a little more expensive. And now the total value of the market basket, or the total cost of the market basket, is $97. So we can see overall price changes. And so the CPI helps us see the trend. So for example, last year, the price of gas went down dramatically. But that would be balanced up by the price of other things like college going up. So we wouldn't necessarily see deflation because we're not going to put only gas in the market basket. This is going to reflect the overall trend in all prices. All right, so now once we have this information, the 2007 market basket is $91, the 2008 market basket is $97. Now what we want to do is we want to basically construct this index. And the key here is that we have to pick a particular year. We're going to pick 2007 and say this year is going to be the base year. We're going to compare all other years to this year. So it's sort of like saying we're going to call this temperature 100 degrees, right? We're just going to pick a number. We're going to say this, we're calling this 100. And then we're going to come up with units and relationships after that. So we assign a price level or an index number of 100 to the base year. We say whatever the price, whatever this market basket cost in 2007, we're going to call that 100, right? And then we're going to see what is the relative price level in 2008. Now keep in mind, this selection is very arbitrary. It doesn't matter what year we pick because we're looking at relative changes. So in order to calculate this price index, we take the price index in the later year. This $97 is the cost of the price index in 2008, and we divide by the cost of the price index in the base year. Okay, and then we multiply by 100 because that's our index number in the base year, and we get this value, 106.59, is the value of the price index in 1997. So what this means is that if we call prices in 2007 100, then we would call prices in 2008 106.59. Maybe in 2009, prices would be 110.5. Okay, and each year we can see what has happened to the overall price level by comparing that back to 1997. I'm sorry, to 2007. It's actually 1997 for the GDP price deflator. That's why I said that. Okay, so this is basically the simplified example of what the Bureau of Labor Statistics does every month of every year. The CPI is actually based on 1982 to 84. So that period, roughly 1983, we call 100. So if our prices today are 230, that means they're 2.3 times whatever the prices were in 1982 to 84. Okay, the price level. So if a car cost $10,000 in 1983, if it cost $23,000 today, that would mean it actually hadn't changed in price at all because the price went up at the same rate as overall prices in our country. If a year's CPI is higher than 100, it means that prices, nominal prices, okay, unadjusted for inflation, are actually higher than they used to be. And if the number is lower, that means they're lower than they used to be. That doesn't generally happen. So how do we use the price index? That's the key right here and what we want to be able to do this week. And then we'll come back and revisit this whole calculation and using price indexes next week. Here's what you want to be able to do. Take the nominal GDP, divide by the price index number, and arrive at real GDP. So if your price index number is, say, 106.59, okay, you take nominal GDP and you don't divide by 106.59, you divide this price index number by 100 first. So you end up at 1.0659, and that's what you're actually going to divide by. So whatever your nominal GDP is, let's say it's a million, you take a million divided by 1.0659, and that will tell you what the real GDP is. Okay, so that's what's going to actually adjust it. And generally it's going to, be making a reduction in what you think the value is. So nominal GDP, again, nominal GDP is the GDP in current year numbers, okay, in whatever the dollar is worth right now. Real GDP, you're pulling that inflation out, okay, you're taking away the inflation so that we can compare from one year to another to get a sense of how much has output changed as opposed to simply changes in price level. And if you take this equation just using simple algebra, you can see that nominal divided by real will actually give you the price index number. So you're going to complete this table as well as one of your assignments. And it's pretty simple, right? Nominal divided by real gives you the price index. Nominal divided by the price index gives you real. There's only 4 spaces that you need to fill in on that particular page. And the last thing you're going to do in class today is you're going to do this sample-free response question. So assume an economy with a public sector. Identify the 2 methods of calculating GDP. Explain why they must have the same value. One shortcoming of using GDP as an indicator of the actual level of national output. And then if nominal GDP increased by 4% in 2006, what are 2 additional pieces of information you'd need before you could conclude that the living standard of the typical person increased by 4% during that year? And that is the end of our video notes.